Welcome everyone. You're expecting Ratan Roy. My name is Emma Maudsley. You'll probably gather I'm not Ratan Roy. He's hoping to join us shortly, but for the moment I will chair this. So I am an academic at Cambridge University, and I lead a centre funded by the erstwhile DFID, now FCDO, on an India-UK Development Partnership Forum. I am really honoured and delighted to welcome Mr. Ashok Malik, who is the Policy Advisor and Additional Secretary at the Ministry of External Affairs in India, and Alexander Evans, a Policy Advisor at Number 10 and formerly Deputy High Commissioner in India. And we're talking today about the merger and the implications of the merger of DFID and the FCO into the FCDO in India-UK relations. We're particularly interested in what that might mean for development partnerships within India and beyond. But I think that Ashok and Alex will be able to range widely. So we're going to start with you, Mr. Malik. Would you please give us your thoughts on what the FCDO merger implies for UK-India relations, where you might see new agendas, directions for us, and what we could do to make it work best in the interests of inclusive development?
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Alex. And thank you for inviting me. And please call me Ashok. We've watched this merger of into what is now the FCDO, which is an abbreviation that will take some getting used to, because FCO is still something we tend to use as a matter of convenience. We've watched this with some interest because within the Ministry of External Affairs in India, we have what we call the Development Partnership Administration, which is our technical assistance or aid, if you like, wing. And DPA grew from nothing, about 15 years ago, into 3 separate subdivisions. It had a junior official heading it at one stage. Now it has an additional secretary officer, which is one rung below permanent secretary, with 3 people just below him assisting him. It's just grown rapidly. And we've debated whether having it externally, like the UK did for many years, would be beneficial or would it not be. And we've finally gone for the model which the FCDO has also gone in for, which is aligning external assistance with overall and broader political external engagement with the world, because there is a sort of strategic congruence there. There is benefit to that alignment that has come into play. So in a sense, when the UK took this decision, it validated our decision as well, and gave us some relief in that we weren't alone in thinking the way we were. And maybe we got something right because the UK done just the same thing. The UK has a small development footprint in India. It was a much larger footprint many years ago, but as India has sort of moved up to from a poor, less developed country to a closer to a middle income country, that footprint has declined, though the work DFID and the FCDO will continue to do with in our states, with private entities, with civil society, is still very important, especially in areas such as skill building, addressing extreme poverty, which is still a problem in India, and which we are hoping to eliminate by 2030 as part of our SDGs, but which will face some stress post-COVID. But much more than work within India, which is important, as no doubt, it is the potential for taking forward our development partnership in other countries, in the global system, in less developed countries, within the Commonwealth especially, and outside, in Africa, in the Caribbean, in the island communities in island countries, and in areas such as humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. We've worked together at the CDRI on platforms such as COP26, because on climate change and renewable energy, again, we have a shared agenda, and we can take our partnership much more strongly to countries that could do with our capacities, with Indian capacities as well as UK capacities. And that is really where I see a lot of hope. We already have a partnership within the Commonwealth, which both countries, I think, want to take forward. Because this is not a competitive zero-sum game at all. What the skills we bring, the strengths we bring complement each other. There's great trust within our systems, and especially if we work together in Africa and the Caribbean in particular, we can bring a lot of benefit to local communities. And I think both the UK and India are seen as trusted development partners by many developing countries, which is, we take the word trust for granted. We take it as just another word just conveniently used and bandied about. But given recent developmental experiences of many countries, including in Asia, with donor countries or supporting countries that have not quite lived up to the initial trust, and I guess you know where I'm pointing to, the trust factor has acquired a new energy, a new significance. And that is where India and the UK working together actually can punch well above our individual weights. So I'd sort of like to stop there because I would like to hear Alex, who has much more to say, no doubt, than I do.
Thank you very much, Ashok. Okay, I'm going to come back and ask you some questions shortly, sure. But I think I would note your point about India choosing the same model as the UK. I think we could also say that the UK is validated by India's choice of model. Interestingly, I have written elsewhere about the idea of the so-called southernization of development, that if we look at a lot of northern development partners, there is unquestionably, in some regards, a convergence, and arguably with a number of DAC donors moving more in the direction of southern partners than vice versa, perhaps. So that would be an example. But Alex, can I turn to you and ask, you're obviously as somebody who was very senior in the High Commission in Delhi, have witnessed firsthand what it was like to work with, when DFID was physically brought in to the High Commission, but as a separate department. Can you tell us a little bit about what you think, first of all, the sort of practicalities of that process are going to be, and then where you might see perhaps the strains and also the advantages of bringing them together?
Absolutely. Well, first off, Emma, thanks very much for having me. It's very good to be back with Ashok Malik. We were just reflecting before the seminar started that the last in-person meeting we had was in February, just before this challenge around COVID really collapsed the possibility of in real life connections and international travel. So it's very good to connect, even if virtually again. And I mean, yeah, on the engagement with India, I think it's important to sort of put it in context to begin with. And I don't want to sort of delve into history, but I think it's important to note that the UK-India relationship has had this long history, but it was not always a long history anchored in equality and partnership from the get-go. I think sometimes there was a bit of that overhang of the colonial relationship. I remember Michael Arthur, who was my first High Commissioner in India when I served there as First Secretary, who was the first High Commissioner to be born after 1947, which might sound like a very small thing, but in terms of the ingredient around the tone of the UK-India relationship, I think is crucially important, and it speaks to what Ashok was talking about in terms of the value and the importance of partnership, not just bilaterally, but vis-a-vis third countries and thematic issues as well. And it's worth noting that the cross-government footprint in India has only grown. So when I served there first in 2005, we had about 800 staff in 7 posts across India. When I returned in 2015, we had 940 staff in 10 posts across India. And obviously DFID was a key ingredient of that, but so were 15 other government departments. And actually career diplomats were very much in a minority, which is what you'd expect, because this is one of the relatively few and very treasured full spectrum relationships that the UK has internationally. And that's only been growing. So I think it's important to put that in context. Ashok mentioned alignment, and I think if you think about the logic of the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and actually of better jointery across those different departments of government and different themes, I think alignment is a very strong word to use, and it's a very appropriate word to use, because I think that's the goal of trying to fuse together and be more purposeful in the joint effort, not just in siloed departmental efforts. Obviously, there was a transition in terms of the development relationship with India, as India moved from being a net aid recipient to a net donor, as DFID programs diminished in size in India, and the nature of a development partnership transited to that much more cooperative framework and collaborative framework with Indian institutions, with Indian research, and with India in international organizations, which I think is important to return to in a moment. So I think that tone has changed. When I was there in 2005, DFID had a separate office in Delhi. When I returned in 2015, DFID was integrated onto the High Commission HQ, along with all these other departments that I've mentioned. I think briefly on the FCDO merger, obviously it excited a lot of comment in different directions, but I think it's worth pausing on a few things. The first is that development is in the title of what is a new department. This is not a takeover by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office of DFID. It is the move away from those two separate departments into a fundamentally new entity. And you can see that in terms of the agenda that's been set out by the Foreign Secretary, but also actually the structural organization, which is still taking place, but the new Director General structure, and the way in which some things are valorized. I mean, I think a very two-dimensional view of development expertise is it's about effectively running money. And I began my life as a DFID consultant before I joined the diplomatic service. So I've seen both worlds, admittedly, with deeper exposure to the world of diplomacy than to that of development. But I think, if you think about the ingredients that development professionals bring, subject matter expertise, a deep appreciation for evidence, often networks, but in many ways would give diplomats a run for their money, because the nature of development work requires partnerships and networks that are altogether different, if you like, to the South Delhi dinner party circuit. So there's an interesting, I would argue, complementarity between networks of relationships at the state level that development professionals often have, or with civil society, or with ingredients of state or union government that are doing things, and the relationships that diplomats tend to have, which are not absent at the state level, but tend to be much more anchored on the union government and union institutions. So I think there's a complementarity there. So I would just argue that in terms of the FCDO as a whole, the logic here is alignment. The logic here is creating something new. The logic here is drawing on the very best of both institutions and cross-pollinating. And the cross-pollination is key. There's plenty for the diplomats to learn from the development professionals. And I would argue that there's equally things that the development professionals can learn from the diplomats. So I hope that kind of gives us sort of a big picture perspective. I think it is important to make sure that you build on those strengths and don't sort of vacate towards some of the institutional weaknesses. So there's been a lot of debate in the UK about machinery of government, which tends to draw in the bandwidth in terms of press and media coverage. Less focus on the human capital issues. So you've seen a very strong focus in this government, notwithstanding the challenges of COVID. Michael Gove gave a very important speech at Ditchley in July on this, and a recognition that we basically need to upgrade the skills, expertise, digital and tech literacy, and capability of government. And a big agenda around that is upgrading the way in which the civil service operates, ideally making it more porous, so there are more windows to come in and out. And I'm conscious that just as the Ministry of External Affairs has been doing more of that, I'm conscious of some of the fellowship programs coming in and out of the MEA. The same is emphatically happening in government now. We're seeing a greater advertisement of roles externally. And if you like, in Britain, it's a move away from that model where it was Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. You relied on the fast stream entrance program, one examination, one chance, one time to get in, one career. And I think, if you look at the complexity of 21st century governance, and I'm always struck here actually by the extraordinary challenges and scale of governance in India, which is, if I take a friend of mine who's mayor of Bristol, his challenge is very different, and I would argue probably less complex than the challenge of urban management or state level management or administration in a very large part of India, be that an urban part or be it a rural part.
Yes.
And I think there's just plenty to learn from each other. So let me close, if I may, on the sort of four things that strike me. The first is there is a lot we can do on themes. Ashok mentioned COP. I think there's a huge amount that can be done on COP, on cyber, digital tech. There is the open societies agenda and the open trade agenda. I would argue that both India and the UK have a strong interest in the ability for services, people, data to flow across borders in an ordered and managed way. But that's actually directly important to both our economies, whether that's looking at the services sector in India or it's looking at financial services or education in the UK. So I think there's a complementarity of interest in a world in which some of those foundational beliefs about openness are coming under challenge. I think on geographies, as Ashok mentioned, I think what's really interesting and exciting here is the third country and third area agenda. And on international institutions. Ashok mentioned Commonwealth, obviously greatly important, but I would also focus on our shared commitment to making sure that international institutions and regional organisations are not just fit for purpose, but are really reaching towards the contemporary challenges we face and anticipating the challenges to come, not just looking backwards or being static in how they engage. A final personal point, which is just to flag that I've seen the efficacy of Indian innovation at first hand. Both even ranging back to being a student at JNU in the late 90s, but also as a diplomat twice in India. And I look at things like digital service delivery by government. Some of the ways in which the extension of payment systems or the extension of identity-based government services have been used in India. The freedom of information legislation, when which that was, or RTI legislation, when that was used. I think there's lots of ways in which India is a trendsetter on these themes, just as I would argue the UK is a trendsetter on a variety of themes too. Okay. And I think there's enormous potential to collaborate on that in ways that can be material for the mission to reduce poverty and improve development outcomes for people around the world, particularly in these highly challenging times given the COVID pandemic. So let me pause there. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. I'm also delighted to see Ratan Roy. Hello, Ratan.
My apologies, it's India. So we had a power outage. The generator went on and caught fire. So I was dealing with that, sorry.
I'm going to pass the chair to you, and I'm sure you'll...
What's happened so far? I've heard Alexander, but I haven't heard a show.
So Ashok told us sort of a little bit about the sort of more positive ways in which Indian development partnerships have been deepening and growing, and talking about the partnerships beyond the sort of perhaps the poverty issues in COP26 as trusted development partners and so on. Now I'm going to add in a small provocation and then hand the chair to you, Ratan. We've not got long, so I want to kind of bring it back down to some of the development challenges. Now, clearly the old model is no longer, it hasn't been the case in India for some time, of very strongly what we might think of as the traditional DFID model of poverty focus. And there's a good argument to be made that while India does of course have a significant problem with poverty, as does the UK, that model is not the right one for India in a country that has so much capacity and so on. But thinking ahead, and this picks up on something that you said, Alex, about looking ahead, for example, and big global public issues. If we take the example of huge potential benefits of the UK and India working together around vaccines, UK and Indian research expertise, allied to India's manufacturing capacity, cold chain know-how, and all the other things. So that's, we could see India and the UK doing well within the business as usual model, but doing better within that. But what we know about the business as usual model, and this touches on some of your open trade, markets, and trade on, is that there's a massive market failure around the pharmaceutical industry and vaccines. And there's reasons for that. because of the very particular expenses and the way that the vaccine market is set up. And that market failure is part of the problem when we've come to the responding to pandemics. We're going to see this again with antimicrobial issues. That's a slow unfolding pandemic. And it is very much in the world's interests, India's interests, and the UK's interest that the massive unfolding storm of antimicrobial resistance that is coming our way is dealt with now. So it seems to me that if India and the UK get together, how are we going to do better, not just within the business as usual model? And Ratan, maybe I can pass to you before we, you might want to amplify or bring Ashok or Alex back to this question. But I want to really push you on whether we are going to move to a more just development outcome within India, the UK and beyond through this partnership.
Okay, thank you. And again, apologies for being late, Ashok, Alexander. The last thing I'm expecting was a fire. So anyway, the fire engine's here and everything is good.
This is 2020.
Yeah, the brilliant people in this office have actually, IT skills. They've got this jury rigged up in 5 minutes. So it's awesome. Right, so let me say, I assume that both Ashok and Alexander have been having a polite diplomatic conversation. So let me ginger things up a bit. And you can take on Emma's sort of question to you as well. So see, for us non-diplomats where we are sitting, speaking in my individual capacity, I have a lot to do with FCDO now and obviously the government of India. You guys are in a bit of a diplomatic corner. I mean, the UK has gone through a Brexit process which is splashing on world pages as we speak, like some kind of, sort of family psychodrama as we speak, right? The relationships with Europe, in which I think India is very heavily invested, are therefore falling. I'm going to spend a lot of my management time in ODI trying to open a Brussels office so I can keep my European contracts alive. And when I was in India, lots of your Indian businessmen would ask me, what's the best place to relocate out of Britain? Is it Portugal or is it Italy? Because they both have sun. So you have this diplomatic challenge, I think, in which you have very clearly stated that you are looking to reinforce partnerships with countries like India, which is very welcome. But how precisely would that articulate given this European psychodrama? And for India, I'll suspend the V for a minute and use the U since you work for MEA. We seem to have disastrous relations now with all our neighbors. Most countries do well when they get along in their neighborhood, and the UK and India seem to be two countries that are doing spectacularly badly in getting along their neighborhood. So, wickedly put, is this an opportunity for two countries that are unable to get on with their neighborhood, to get on with each other and obviate that disadvantage? Or are you going to work together and help each other get along better in your neighborhood? And would that be a welcome way to look forward? So that's my diplomatic question. On the economic side, my question is this, that there is a profound disappointment with the G20 and other multilateral forms of engagement. And my sense with COP21 too is there's a sense of fatigue, that this level of repeated multilateral engagement is not even achieving inframarginal results. The multilateral community has not come together on COVID in anywhere like we thought they would. And India holds the G20 presidency in 2 years' time. Britain holds the COP next year. So would you be looking at Indo-UK cooperation, closer cooperation, as a way in which to bring economic diplomacy back in a meaningful way to multilateral affairs? Since both countries place a lot of emphasis on the economic side of diplomacy, I like that and I welcome that in the FCDO merger. Mutual interest is about good economics together. You mentioned trade. I think there's also this form of cooperation. So can you speak to these elements? And then, of course, the vaccine and pandemic question that Emma asked. And then, Emma, please tell me when we're out of time. Go ahead, please. Ashok, would you like to start?
So, thanks, Ratin. Typically, you've raised a number of dynamite issues, some of which I can address, some of which I can't. I would like to disagree with your contention that India doesn't get along with its neighbors. We do have some problems with some neighbors. We know which one. I don't want to make it about that. But if you look at economic cooperation and, frankly, developmental cooperation, some of our biggest success stories have been with our neighbors, with Bangladesh, with Sri Lanka, with Afghanistan. Even though Afghanistan is not a direct proximate neighbor, we don't share. There's a country in between these days. Okay, so but many of the hard-won gains in Afghanistan in terms of education, skill building, agriculture in the past 20 years have been because of Indian efforts and because the Indian model has found acceptability there. Also, to use a colloquialism, Indian assistance delivers more bang for the buck. Our assistance is more cost effective. Overheads are lower. Our salary structures are more efficient. And you can see that if you go to Afghanistan and you see, a traditional multilateral assistance network and you see it in the Indian one. The results are as good, if not better, and frankly, it's cheaper. In Bangladesh in particular, or even Myanmar, small connectivity projects have gone a long way. Despite all our political problems, the small connectivity projects have gone a long way in linking local and regional economies between Indian states and Bangladesh or Myanmar. I'll give you just one example. When the British left India in 1947, there were 6 train links between what became East Pakistan and India, or what became Bangladesh later in India. These 6 train links stopped functioning in 65. 4 of those 6 are now functional again. 2 more will be ready early next year, and 3 new ones, in addition to these 6, are going to be ready at the end of 2021, early 2022. This sort of connectivity is not just big picture connectivity, what people, jet setters flying from one capital to another. It's actually helping local businesses and local skills. Local farmers sell produce across the frontier and so on. Not all of this is, strictly speaking, part of a developmental program. It's straightforward economics, but of course, where one ends and the other begins, as you yourself have suggested, is not always clear. Since you spoke about the current situation, and before that, since Alexander spoke about India's achievements in the digital sphere, especially with a biometric identity system, which has become a sort of a base on which the private sector, the developmental sector, and of course the public sector can actually build applications for a variety of purposes. This is an experience we can take with our British friends, to our UK friends, not just to countries in Africa and in the Pacific Islands or the Caribbean. Frankly, you can take this to what I would call less developed regions, even within the relatively developed countries. We talk about the global South. Actually, what the Brexit challenge told us, and what many similar debates even in India are telling us, is that there's also a domestic South, which we tend to ignore. And for instance, one of our successes during this COVID challenge, and no one has got it completely right, no country has, we've all struggled, but one of the things we've managed to do in India is actually send cash, have cash sent to about 200 million families. And this is, 400 million families, what am I saying? 400 million families. And 400 million individuals or families, call it what you will. And this cash has actually reached very quickly because of a digital banking system set up with this triangulation of biometric identity, or the Aadhaar number, mobile-based applications, and the Jan Dhan zero balance bank account, which is really functions of a mobile phone. Now, you would expect that India has been asked questions about this by poor countries in in Africa or in Asia. I've had questions about the efficacy of the system coming from Argentina, a relatively developed country, because Argentina discovered in the midst of this crisis that there was a large unbanked population which couldn't get money and couldn't access money during a lockdown. And how did you get money across to them? Now, even in a country like Britain, which is going to see a massive overhaul of many public systems, including health systems and welfare systems in the coming months and years, and as all of us are post-COVID, in the case of Britain, post-Brexit as well. Many of these experiences and learnings can be very useful. So, frankly, we are living in a world where development doesn't just flow from top to bottom. Actually, it flows in all directions. So there's an osmosis, which is not just a vertical movement downwards, but it's something we can all learn from. So what India and Britain do together, what discussions we have together in terms of, say, digital delivery of welfare services, can help us help third countries, can actually also help us help each other. So I don't know if I've made much sense here, but I've tried to cover the gamut of issues which you raised, and perhaps Alexander could add to this with more clarity.
Alexander, could you perhaps speak also to the multilateral dimension that I mentioned? And of course,
yes, happily try and do so. I mean, look, the first thing is on the EU exit negotiations. I mean, I'm conscious that the tamasha of any negotiations sort of absorbs a lot of attention and time. I would just say that, I think sometimes what is important is to think in time about international cooperation and engagement and not get anchored on the moment. And I think the risk perhaps particularly in the context of this week, is we get anchored on the moment and distracted by the moment. I think the durability, not just of the UK-India relationship, but also Britain's global engagement, will be evident in the months and years to come. And that includes relationships with near neighbours as well as with neighbours further away. But I think, let me just pick up on, Ratan, you mentioned the importance of economic diplomacy, and I very much agree. I think there's a renewed interest in economic diplomacy. That's where, speaking very frankly, development professionals often had deeper expertise along with trade negotiators than necessarily the diplomats that populated the old Foreign and Commonwealth Office as was. I would also argue there's a hugely material and important space that we are being much more attentive to, which is regulatory diplomacy. So I think, if traditionally regulation was viewed as a rather nerdy subject, there might be appetite and interest episodically when there was a market access issue or a liberalization issue, but it wasn't something that necessarily animated and gained the attention of diplomats on a consistent basis. I think it's materially important to all our interests to think about the regulatory frameworks, not just around tech and cyber, on which our Prime Minister spoke at the UN General Assembly last year, but also, as Emma said, on public health, on medicines, thinking about the antimicrobial resistance, on the movement of professionals across borders, the huge importance that's attached to the UK of health professionals who are qualified elsewhere, including, in particular, I think, Indian qualified medical professionals, very material to the National Health Service, very material to UK PLC. And I think that economic and regulatory policy agenda is not by way of an effort to re-regulate the world. This is not the effort to do License Raj version 2 at the international level. But it's, if you like, trying to make sure that we shape the acquis. Because I think there's a very strong interest, not just for India and the UK, but also for developing countries and for poor people internationally, to make sure that we have an international cross-border framework that enables opportunity and development and doesn't disable it. And particularly against a somewhat sort of somewhat negative tone vis-a-vis trade, cross-border movement, cross-border engagement, data flows coming from different directions in international policy. I think this very much links into a very major theme for this government in the UK, which is the levelling up agenda and thinking about communities beyond London, thinking about the challenges of lower opportunity in parts of the UK that need to be properly addressed. So you see a government that's talking about industrial strategy, talking about levelling up, having an agenda that is much less focused on London and the southeast than perhaps was the case with previous administrations. And I would argue that agenda reads across actually to development communities, because actually many of the lessons are going to be equally relevant for how you approach Rochdale, where my dad was born, as how you approach development interventions internationally. So I think there's actually a cross-pollination here between domestic and international that will become more important, not less. And to that I would again add regulatory diplomacy as being a crucial ingredient. I think, to Emma's question about, okay, what's the future? What's the next steps around this? Emma mentioned very much the public health agenda. I would also mention development capital, because I think, there is a lot of capital around. A lot of that capital is a bit contingent. It flows in, it flows out. Have we made money this week? Or it comes with strings attached. And I'm thinking in particular about some of the new forces of capital in the world. So I think it's very, very important to think about how do we structure the availability of capital and models of capital availability, but not just support SMEs in India or the UK, but also kind of there to properly support infrastructure development, for example, in a way that is transparent and properly managed. So I think there's a really interesting joint agenda on development capital that has real promise. And finally, but by no means least, the health agenda, the public health agenda. Emma, you're quite right. Antimicrobial resistance, the availability of vaccines or other drugs, thinking about also telemedicine and cross-border medicine, which is vital again to both the professionals I talked about earlier, but also actually e-services, where we've seen a very big take-up of e-services, for example, with general practitioners in the UK. I was working on the COVID response in number 10 earlier this year. I think there's something that is potentially transformational in some of that, but it needs to be seized, it needs to be purposed, and not just individually by one government, but collectively across the board. And I'm reminded of perhaps one of the most extraordinary moments I had actually early in my second tenure as a diplomat in India, when I went to a very major pharmaceutical firm in Gujarat, and was frankly quite astounded. As I said, I'm a sort of political military security person by background, not really an economic diplomat by background, but was absolutely astounded at the scale of the production facility, but also the scale of the R&D capability and the development capability. I think there is a really interesting world of possibilities around matching that fundamental industrial capability that is there in both our countries in different ways, that economic diplomacy and regulatory diplomacy and diplomacy agenda, which is how do we shape the international debate on some of these issues, and the foundation stone of partnership. But this isn't London speaking and demanding everybody else listens. It's not Delhi speaking and demanding everybody else listens. It's much more a collaborative partnership, both between our countries, but with many other stakeholders as well. And if I may close, and Ratin, I mean, that also extends very much to the professional development community. So thinking about ODI and elsewhere, it's how do we really make the most of the evidence base, the expertise that lies outside, and the challenge. Because the risk sometimes of government is we can suffer from initiative-itis. Yeah? It's very tempting to kind of go for something without being evidence-based in terms of, will it work? What's the evidence from interventions before? And I think that's actually one of the strands from the development community that is really important to develop effective public and international public policy responses as we go forward.
Maybe it is time to bring the audience in. We have 5 minutes for questions, but I can't resist saying that one benefit of emphasizing FCDO India cooperation would be that perhaps because of the emphasis on poverty, there's a global impression that UK development policy had become rather Africa-centric and fragile state-centric, and that the engagement with middle-income countries was not there. And the FCDO merger, I think, presents a huge opportunity to reset that and to enhance engagement with middle-income countries in Latin America and Asia. Asia is losing LDCs. There aren't many LDCs to work with. So I'd also like to add that to this pot. And let me leave you with a provocative question again. You can respond if you wish. Both our countries are tanking in terms of GDP. Britain, I think, by -10, India expected -15. So one real outcome of this cooperation would be if we could build back together faster, and it'd be good to see where and how that could be done in terms of bilateral economic diplomacy. So I don't have too many questions. I have one which I can take. The other I can't, because it's a question about what committees will be set up, and I refuse to let that come in. I know there are diplomats here, but I'm not going to bring in committees and working groups. Good Lord. This is an interesting question, and Ashok, this is for you. So the question is, what role does soft power play? And soft power defined by democracy, culture, ability to innovate frugally in the Indian model of development. This comes from Dan Banik in Oslo. But let me also ask you, Alexander, what role does British soft power play and how do you define that? Perhaps you could close with that, Emma, if we don't have any more time.
Sure.
Ashok?
Should I take that? Yeah. So this is a very interesting question because soft power is, of course, defined differently by different people and sometimes erroneously confused with cultural diplomacy. But I think soft power in the Indian context refers to an adherence to norms, an adherence to democracy, and adherence to multi-stakeholderism and consultation in the broadest possible sense. Of course, there are aberrations, as there are in any country, but broadly the Indian system has stuck by these principles. And if you look at our developmental assistance and our technical cooperation with other countries, whether in Asia, in Africa, in the Indian Ocean, what marks out Indian initiatives or Indian supported initiatives is the degree of consultation and buy-in by the local community. It's very much something which the local community prioritizes and can use immediately. It's not a grand plan or a grand project that appears out of nowhere and doesn't have any immediate utility. So let me put it this way: Indian soft power will inevitably guide India to spending taxpayer rupees or dollars to building a railroad which will have passengers from day one, rather than towards building an airport which is still waiting for a plane. So in that sense, when an Indian project turns up in an external country, there is a sense that this is going to help us in some form or the other. It's been tried and tested in India. India is doing something which has worked for its own people. And as I said at the beginning, there is an element of trust. And that I have found helps us in many of the projects we do. I don't know if I've answered your question, but I've tried.
No, you have. I must say that I found that in my work in Africa doing this outsourced cooperation. And that trust element, I think, is something that the UK-India triangular relation capitalize on. Alex, some final words before I hand over to Emma?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, I think, the soft power debate is a muddled one some of the time, but I think there is something important about values. There is something important about, I would also mention institutions around open societies. And here I'd mention the BBC. The contemporary BBC is not, with respect to Mark Tully, it's not Mark Tully broadcasting anymore. It's that sense of a range of broadcasters and content that are very germane to different language groups and to young people. And I do think there is something there about trust and about cultural attraction, where India and the UK enjoy significant ingredients of that. They're differentiated ingredients, but I think that's material. And part of the challenge in the 21st century will be, what operating model do you want to live under? What's the aspiration? And I would argue that many more people would prefer to live in a society like India or the United Kingdom than some of the alternatives. And it's not necessarily that the alternatives are the hard, murderous authoritarianism of the 20th century, but a cold, impersonal, and exploitative authoritarianism of the 21st. Is that what people want? So I think the development model is intimately linked into that wider societal model. And it's not trying to reforge a cultural Cold War in the 21st century. but it's recognizing that value of open societies, inclusive societies, and societies that are attentive to the needs of their citizens.
Thank you. May both societies survive and prosper as open and inclusive ones. God knows enough challenges on that front in both countries. Emma, over to you for some last words.
Well, I really sincerely like to thank everyone, Ratan, Ashok, Alexander, for taking this on. We could obviously all talk for a very long time, and I'm aware time is short. We have another webinar, many people to go to. All I can say is I'd encourage, there will be more webinars, and we might pick up on some of the issues that have been hinted at all the way along, like China, which has not been mentioned by name, but everyone's pointing to. And I think that we might try and take a more critical investigation of some of these, the ways in which China is acting as a foil to claims about our own roles in the world. I personally, I'm very excited by the India-UK project. I think actually, although I have my concerns about the FCDO merger, I think that it has a huge amount of potential in India. And while I am deeply appreciative and very, I'm a great friend of DFID, and I'm sorry to see its loss. I do think that it was a mistake not to work more strategically with the so-called middle-income countries, China, India, Brazil, of course, South Africa. I think that it's really important that these global partnerships for development are working with such powerful, creative, important countries like India. And to echo Ashok's point, this is very much about south to north as well as north to south. We're in a new world of international development. And at the same time, while the bottom billion is dropping out of the rhetoric, I also think it's very challenging now that thanks to COVID, we are seeing a resurgence of basic poverty, basic hunger, be it in Rotherham or in Agra. So I do think there is a quite extraordinary developmental challenge. And in this horrific year of 2020, it's time to grasp some new opportunities and models. So I think the FCDO merger is a very exciting one. I take Alex's point as well, that the High Commission doesn't just comprise the FCDO. In fact, we've been having conversations with some people from the NHS and from the health sector based in Delhi to think about UK-India health partnerships around vaccines. So there's lots of possibility. I personally don't think that just flagging, we have to be careful not to just flag China as the sort of ghastly other and hold tight to India-UK sort of projection. I think we have to work harder to make India-UK really a genuinely inclusive champions for a new economic possibility. But that's for another webinar. Ratan, I'll leave it to you to finish, but I just do want to thank you very much and encourage you to come and have a look at the IUK partnership website, where we're really hoping to build on these relationships.
Not much to say. Thank you, Ashok, who's an old friend.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander, for that. I hope to see you very soon as I can get flights and you don't quarantine me unreasonably, which it's reasonable now to quarantine me, but I hope it will be unreasonable soon. And I can finally come and set up shop at ODI and then engage with you and, of course, with Emma. Ashok and I will continue to engage. Thank you, everyone, for coming in. I apologize that I couldn't take your questions, Sachin, but we are really out of time. So good luck and have a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Look forward to meeting you, Ratan.
Thank you, Ratan. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Alexander.
Bye, Ashok. Nice to see you again.
Bye-bye. See you soon.